What's going on, everyone? In today's episode, I'm going to show you the best time to thin your different crops. Let's go. So when it comes to thinning, it is really important to do so. And a lot of gardeners don't like to do this because they get sentimental about their crops, and I get it. Your seeds sprouted for you. It's endearing, but it's actually not setting them up for success by not thinning, especially when they're in cells like this. There's a couple things that can happen. The first thing is that they get really crowded in the root system, and that ultimately starves them of water and nutrients, which leads them to be stressed. Second thing is that because they're growing in a confined space, they don't have a lot of room for them to kind of stretch their leaves out without actually crowding themselves out or crowding their neighbor out. And what happens is then they get stressed for sunlight. And then you start to get leggy seedlings where they start to stretch and they get all kind of misshapen. The third thing that can happen is when you're growing crops in a small area, it can oftentimes hold moisture as they get bigger, and that moisture can lead to things like root rot or damping off, which are problems that happen later on when there's not enough airflow in between your seedlings. And so thinning your plants out is actually a really beneficial thing, and it's going to set them up for success. And it's also going to ensure you're going to be planting the healthiest plants out in your garden. Okay, so when it comes to different crops here, the time that you thin is going to vary for a couple different things, and we'll get into that. I've got here a tray of some tomato seedlings. They're just starting to put on their first set of adult leaves. I got here a tray of some broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, some brassicas, and then I also have here some much more developed peppers. Now these peppers, they've been in this tray for about 4 weeks now, so they're pretty developed, as you can see. 2 sets of adult leaves, they're looking great. I also have here some onions. These are just starting to sprout, so I'm not too worried about thinning these yet, but we'll talk about something like that. And then we also have here a tray of some herbs. This is our English thyme, and you can see pretty small cell size, but there's quite a few plants growing up in these smaller cells here. The time that you're going to be thinning is based on a couple different variables. The first variable is how small the cell size is. Like I said, in this tray right here with the thyme, these cells are really small. And so the amount of soil that's in those cells is not that much. And so when you have cells that are small and you have a lot of plants growing in that same cell, you're going to be competing for the space that's available. And so you want to make sure that you thin faster earlier when the cell size is small. Compare that to cell size like this. These are some 6-cell trays here. If I was growing those thyme plants in these 6-cell trays, I probably wouldn't even thin at all. And that's because there's enough soil for the pace at which those plants grow. We'll talk about that in a second, little hint, little spoiler. But the pace at which those plants grow, there really won't ever be any competition in these size trays until they're ready to move out into the garden. So I probably wouldn't thin in that case. Now compare that to something like a tomato, right? Tomato, it's growing in a small cell like this. They grow pretty fast. They're already putting on adult leaves, and because they grow pretty fast and the root system grows pretty fast, they won't last that long in these trays here, so we're going to thin very early on. In the case of these 3-inch pots here, these onions are growing up in what we considered a multi-sown method, and that means we're sowing a bunch of seeds very densely in this tray, and when it comes to onions, we're not going to thin them at all. So it does really vary on the crop, but it also varies on the size of the cell. That's the first biggest thing. The larger the cell is, the more forgiveness it's going to have, but also you don't necessarily want to go, as we've talked about, up to a larger cell size just because that can have some negative side effects as well. Go check out our seed starting mistakes video. It's really important that you don't start in too big of a cell because that soil can hold on to too much water, which leads to dampening off and root rot, which is a problem. The second variable that decides kind of when I thin has to do with how fast the crop grows. So in the case of this English thyme, like I just alluded to, this crop grows really slowly. And that correlates to how fast the root system develops as well. And so despite the fact these are in really, really small cells, these are going to be fine growing in here for another week or two before I either have to thin or move them to a larger container. If you didn't want to do any thinning, spoiler for the video we're going to do next, you don't have to thin if you plan on moving it to a larger container to accommodate for that extra root growth and just give them more soil to kind of adventure in so they're not too cramped. You could do that. But assuming you don't want to move them to a larger container and you want to just thin to buy time until they're ready to plant out in the garden, this is when you'd thin something like a slow growing seedling, right? So we have here, this is the English thyme, and we're going to thin to about 2 plants. Now with thyme, because it can grow up pretty closely together, these cells here that have like four plants growing in them, we're going to thin those down to 2 plants. We don't need 1 plant because that plant is so small and so slow growing that it'll be fine for the next month in this tray despite it being a small cell. Same thing goes for this lemongrass here. This lemongrass is a real slow growing grass. It's an herb, and because it's slow growing, we can leave these in this tray here for probably the next at least 3 to 5 weeks, which is surprising. But because there's a few growing in here that are like 3 plants per cell, we're gonna come in here and thin down to 1 plant because it's quite a lot larger than the thyme, but it is still slow growing. And so the pace really dictates when we're gonna be thinning. Compare that to, like I said, a tomato. Tomato is very fast growing. I mean, or even this pepper. I mean, like these peppers are only 5 weeks old. And look at they are fully developed. These things are ready to rock. And so because a faster growing seedling is obviously going to have a faster growing root system, we want to accommodate for that foliage growth. We don't want it to be too crowded up top, but also that corresponding root development, which we don't want it to be too crowded down below as well. And so we're going to be thinning to just 1 seedling per cell. Or in some cases, we're also going to thin, and then in the next couple weeks, we're also going to transplant to accommodate just so that that 1 plant is not too cramped. Once you see that first set of adult leaves kind of squeaking through those cotyledon leaves opening up, that is when we can start to thin, because that has a really high probability of survival after that point. And so the mortality rate of brassicas, pretty high. Mortality rate of tomato seedlings, pepper seedlings, pretty low. And so that really has a lot to decide on how aggressive we're gonna thin, but also when we're gonna thin. Next, I'm gonna show you how to thin. If you've never done this before, it's really simple. Check it out. So with these tomatoes here, like I said, we wanna thin to 1 plant. We don't want 2 seedlings growing in this tray because they grow fast and the cells are small. And they also have a really high chance of survival. So in the case here, we're starting to get 2 seedlings here. We're gonna come in and we're gonna choose the healthiest one. Obviously this seedling here, if we're isolating that out, this seedling is larger, starting to get some adult leaves than this one here. So we're gonna come in here and at the base, we're gonna clip that out. Coming over here, we're gonna see, okay, there's another one here. Sometimes they look identical and you really have to kind of just eeny, meeny, miny, moe it, and someone's unlucky. Now, in the case of this right here, one is more centered. I will always, if it looks identical, I'll always pick the one that's more centered, just so that it's not gonna be growing up on the edge of a cell that could interfere with, another plant's development. Same thing with this one here, this crop, or this tomato here is right on the edge, but they look about identical. Coming over here, this one here, they both look about identical, so I'm gonna pick the one that's more centered. And you just do that, it's really simple. In this case here, we have three seedlings growing up. This one, as you can tell, is far more underdeveloped. So I'm gonna take this one first, and then I'm gonna pick the most centered, which happens to be the biggest. And that's what we're gonna do with this whole tray, is gonna get thinned down to 1 seedling. It's really important to have some nice precision snips. I can't tell you how nice it is to have accuracy. We use either these or we use the Fisker's microtip snips to get in there so we have nice accurate cuts. Now in the case of these seedlings here, these are just fresh, these are brand new. Now some people would say wait until they start to form the first set of adult leaves. Because I'm going off the premise that the chance of these dying, if the conditions are kept great, is pretty low, I'm still gonna come in here and thin. I'm gonna thin 1, just so I don't have to come back and do it later, because I'm doing it right now anyways, might as well save myself a step. And that is tomatoes. So up next is a slow growing herb like this lemongrass here. So with lemongrass, like I said, we wanna wait for this plant to get developed. These new seedlings here that have just like 1 or 2 sets of leaves, we're not gonna thin those just yet, because the chance of those dying is pretty high. But once they start to grow and something like lemongrass gets 2 or even 3 sets of leaves, we're gonna come in here and thin. And there's not many that need to be thinned in this because again, germination rate's gonna be lower, the die-off rate's gonna be higher. So I'm not gonna be that aggressive, but I am gonna come in here and I'm gonna thin out these smaller, lesser developed lemongrass seedlings because I want this taller one right here. This is the one that I want. So I'm just coming here and thinning out those down to just 1 like we have here, and that's gonna be far better because even though this plant is slow growing and it has a high chance of dying, once it gets to this level here, if nothing else changes, it should survive just fine. But when it's young, the chance of it dying is really high, so I'm not gonna thin until it gets to this point here. Same thing with some of these. These are getting to that point where there's about 3 sets of adult leaves. We're gonna come in here and clip those out. And same thing would be done with the thyme. thyme is really sensitive to moisture changes. If you overwater this for even a couple days, you're gonna start to see it dropping leaves and dying. So I'm gonna come in here, and again, I'm gonna prune this out. I'm gonna thin this out to about, because these are so small, root system is so small, I'm gonna thin these down to about 2 plants per cell. I got 1, I got 2. Here I've got 1, here I've got 2. I thin that out there. And that way I have 2 seedlings growing. There's 1, 2, 3. Take one of those out. There's another one. Some of these here have like 4 or even 5 plants growing in the same cell, and that's just like, this is chaos here. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 plants. It's just ridiculous. Obviously, I must have been a little bit shaky when I was putting the seeds in this one, but they're also really, really small seeds. So someone with shaky hands like myself that would never want to be a surgeon sometimes have too many seeds in a cell. So I've got 2 there, and I can come through here and you get the idea. I'm just going to thin these really slow growing herbs down to about 1 to 2 seedlings per cell. All right, last are your kind of brassica crops, or really anything that grows pretty fast but also has a high likelihood of dying. So check it out. We can start to see some adult leaves just starting to poke through. When those seed leaves, those cotyledon leaves start to spread, you'll notice right in the middle, you've got some adult leaves poking through. And so some of these are not fully developed yet. Some of these need a little bit more time. So I'm not gonna thin all of them, but for the sake of this example here, I'm gonna show you what I do when they get to that stage. I don't wanna let them form adult leaves right away, because as you know, on brassicas and those fast growing crops, the leaves get really big, really fast. And I don't want them to shade, because what happens is then they're gonna start to get leggy. Even as a seedling, check it out. Look at this, if you come in close, look at this seedling right here. Look at how leggy these seedlings are. And this is in ideal conditions with great sunlight. These are getting full sun right out here in the greenhouse. And because these are growing up so closely together, we're starting to get some legginess on these, on this purple Savoy cabbage here. So I'm gonna come in here and clip that out. That's gonna free up that root space and that leaf zone for those leaves to kind of spread out without feeling like they're, you know, right up against bumping elbows with someone else. So then I'm also gonna come in here, I'm gonna thin out these ones down to just 1 per cell. Again, they have a high likelihood of dying. And so I don't want to thin too early, because if they do die, then we're left with a cell that has nothing, and that stinks. I'm gonna come in here, I'm gonna thin these down to 1 plant at the point when they start to form that first set of adult leaves. And again, the cell size matters as well. Because these are in a 6-cell tray, they're gonna have, look at this. This is crazy. These little plants have the tiniest leaves, but check out that beautiful, absolutely gorgeous root system. That root development, you need to account for that. It's like an iceberg, right? There's usually 25% above the water and 75% below the water. And so you wanna make sure that you account for that, because you don't want those roots to be too crowded, especially in a small cell like this. Having a smaller cell allows you to grow more plants in a smaller area, meaning you're gonna be more efficient. And efficiency is everything, especially when you're growing seedlings indoors, when you might have 1 or 2 grow lights to share between 200, 300 plants. So once you thin, you're gonna be left with something like this. Now I thinned these peppers about 2 weeks ago, and you'll notice we're talking 1 seed per cell, and you have these beautiful rows with lots of airflow. Even as these plants get bigger, these are growing in a 200 cell tray. They're gonna be ready for transplanting. Watch next video, you're gonna love it. But these plants are ready to be transplanted. They've been growing in here for 5, almost going on 6 weeks. They've been seeded for 6 weeks, growing for 5 weeks, and there's no problems at all. No signs of stress. The root system is gorgeous and beautiful, as you can see. Absolutely super developed, which is awesome. And because there's no stress, these are ready to rock, and they're gonna grow so much better. And you can see small cells, but 1 plant makes a big difference. So these peppers look gorgeous, and that's what you wanna look for when you're thinning. And so I hope this video helped. I hope you learned something new. If you did, make sure to hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. And if you're a beginning gardener that hates thinning, let me know in the comments box down below. This video kind of helped encourage you to make that step to thinning. I want to encourage you guys also invest in some small snips, whether that's these tiny little snips here, these herb snips, or some microtip snips, something like that. You want to go in there and you want to have precision so you don't make a mistake. So I want to encourage you guys to invest in these. They're a small investment, but they make a big difference. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Hopefully you all learned something new. And as always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow bigger. Take care. Bye.